Don't tell me what you want to do in the world. Tell me what problem you're trying to solve. Because when you solve a problem, you bring your whole self to the problem and your lived experience. If I told you, hey, what do you want to do? I want to be a doctor. You framed yourself in this box about what you can and can't do based off what society's rules are.
Welcome to the Optimized Workplace. I'm your host, Fran Dean Bishop, where our discussions with influencers, experts, and innovators are helping transform the well-being and sustainability of today's workplaces and spaces. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Bryan Buckley, a health equity-focused and systems-oriented leader in his role as Director of Health Equity Initiatives at the National Committee for Quality Assurance, NCQA, which we know them as. At NCQA, Bryan supports health equity strategy across multiple departments and even integrates those for better health equity concepts into existing programs and projects. Dr. Buckley also serves as adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University School of Medicine, where he teaches, coaches, supports, and supervises graduate students at the School of Medicine and Biomedical Graduate Education. Dr. Buckley, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
You wear multiple hats, as we kind of discussed before we got started. So tell us a little bit about yourself and what's the most exciting thing that you're working on right now.
Ooh, a big one. The most exciting thing I'm working on. So yeah, as you see, I have many different hats. I like to look at myself in kind of three different areas. One, I'm really a practitioner of the work and where I do a lot of that work with NCQA. But then also very much an academic. So I like to say I'm in this pracademic space where it's like, I also love the aspect of teaching and just really understanding the literature as a whole. And that's where my Georgetown love comes. And then I just love being in community. So I do a lot of work in the community, both in national and local not-for-profits on how do we address some of the social needs and aspects of wellness. I think the most interesting project that I'm working on currently right now, I'll focus more on NCQA for this one, is I'm actually working on a really cool project around greenhouse gas reduction and working with health plans on how they're thinking about just greenhouse gas reduction strategies. And these can include both from an internal organization perspective, what they're doing, remote working from home policies, but then also what they can do in contracting. So just really exploratory and seeing, okay, what are people doing, what people not doing? And I would say more locally and personally, I do a lot of amazing, great work for an organization here in the DC area called Food and Friends, which I'm on the board for.
I know it well.
As the holidays come approaching, we just had our slice of life. And so one of the benefits I have is actually being able to volunteer and send medically tailored meals to people with chronic health conditions across DC. So that actually gives me quite a lot of joy right now. So I would say that is probably some of the cool things I'm working on right now.
That is phenomenal. Oh my goodness. Okay. So we have so much more to talk about than I ever expected. Sometimes I'll be honest with you, full transparency here. As a podcast host, you read your guest's bio and you're like, okay, I think I know what this is going to be about. I would imagine this is what, from a mini Oprah perspective, it's like, okay, I read the guest. Okay, this is what you got for me today. Okay. I guess it'll be okay. You are much more interesting than you looked on paper. Like, wow.
Maybe I should put more things on paper about myself.
Well, okay. So first of all, you're speaking my language. I love to talk about sustainability and ESG models. And so our team just launched, drumroll, a program called Well Team Culture, which is really focusing on how small businesses or mid-sized businesses can really focus on health and well-being and sustainability in a larger cosm of space, right? As opposed to you're an enterprise level, 20,000 size company organization, which is who we normally work with around that. It's easy for them because they can charge it to a team of people and they can go out and do it. Much harder for a smaller organization to focus on, what's our, like you said, greenhouse gas emission, or what's our carbon footprint when it comes to X and carbon footprint when it comes to travel and things like that. So I would love to delve into this a little bit because you're speaking my language, because I truly believe that everyone can have a seat at the table around this component and really making a contribution to it. We all live in a city or an environment or a community or rural, whatever. And so we're all breathing the same air. When the air came down from Canada this year, we all saw the orange air, right? So we're all breathing this air. So we should all have a part in this. So unpack that for us a little bit about, what you're seeing from a trend perspective when it comes to the greenhouse gases, and just starting the conversation? If you're looking to start the conversation in your community or in your organization, where does it start?
As I mentioned earlier, my core is definitely a public health practitioner through and through. And so, as you said it just right, when it comes to climate change, greenhouse gases, we all have a part to play. This is a joint contribution that as a global society, we actually have thought it's really about humanity as a whole. And so I always like to start with that. The angle from a health care perspective is we know that healthcare contributes to about nearly 25 to 30% of carbon emissions. And so healthcare has a part to play in like really thinking about, as I said, everyone has a part to play. And so how do we actually start thinking about some of these things when it comes to aspects about sustainability? I remember in a previous employer I had, even cutting down on how we think about paper, how much paper we print. Everyone actually had like 50 sheets of paper that they had per week. And you had to get like authorization to get anything more. But then even in the role of, working from home, which I think has definitely revolutionized the way hybrid working as a whole. And we saw this actually during the COVID-19 pandemic, that greenhouse gas reduction actually went down because no one was really driving anywhere. And so there was this opportunity for us to really make an impact there as well. And being in the DMV area, anyone knows it takes a while to get to work sometimes. And when you think about all those carbon emissions, they definitely impact the work that we do. So I think as I tell people about unpacking it, I think there's so many different ways that you can kind of tackle that. One, I think from a health equity perspective, understanding the health equity implication for climate change, because we know when it gets hot, when the globe gets hotter and you see more different changes in weather, that impacts different communities differently. If you are in a community where there's lots of homelessness and we're getting, either hotter than normal temperatures or colder than normal temperatures, we know that's impacting a certain group of people. And so as we think about our communities, we have to kind of take this like broad view of like, when this does happen, and it will happen, how are we also being proactive to see the people that are going to experience the most disparities from climate? How are we making sure that we're protecting them and actually making sure that we alleviate many of the disparities that compounding disparities that they were already dealing with before, but addressing that earlier to get people out of the way?
I like that. So are there one or two strategies that we can, let's put on our corporate hat, right? So we have a lot of corporate listeners, people who are responsible for large teams, and those teams are they're remote or they're hybrid or they're trying to figure it out. Are there one or two strategies you could recommend that they begin to tinker with, to begin either the conversation as they try to move towards it? It doesn't have to be, I think that, sometimes it's just about getting the conversation off the ground and letting people feel like I do have something to contribute to this. So anything you'd recommend?
Yeah, well, the first one I would say is around awareness. Just become aware. Have a plan. Like, I'm very hesitant on specific things to do, like tactic wise, because it really depends on the organization. What type of global footprint do you have? Are you across many different cities? Do you work in a big office building? Are you a small business owner? What is your contribution to it? But I would say the first thing is around awareness. So I always remember this one book by Dr. Ella Washington. It's very much more focused on the DEI space, but she calls it the necessary journey. And she kind of has these different like phases that you kind of go through as you're going on this necessary journey. I think climate, and as we think about sustainability and wellness and equity, they're all the necessary journeys that we have to go through. So she talks about awareness, like how do we make sure we're aware about what the problem is and actually seeing how we can address this? How do we actually think about the assurance or accreditation or whatever you might have you to say, okay, what do I need to see about what I need to be doing? So that adherence is what she's really focusing on. Okay, how can I make sure I adhere to whatever standards are out there for my company size? And that's why I said it depends on who you are and what ability you have to make a difference there. But then it gets into the aspect of how do we start thinking about the tactics? What are the tactics that I need to do and move this forward? And as I said, that will differ from every single person. But then we get into the fourth part around integration. How are we thinking about integrating into our corporate strategy as a whole? Because often people look at climate change as this like kind of or even DEI, it's like this one thing you do over here, but it's incorporated. It impacts the communities and the workers that you have in your organization, but then also the communities that you serve directly and indirectly. And then the last part is really that sustainability. How do we make sure we keep those gains going forward and keeping that momentum? And I take all these things because my background is also in change management. That's what I do at Georgetown. And so I like that framework I think we're on this necessary journey because if we fail when it comes to addressing climate change, it hurts us all. And so I think that's where it's that necessary journey that we all need to take together.
Yeah, I really appreciate the fact that you've made it so accessible in the conversation, right? And that you really do have to start with, like you said, something very simple like awareness of, what is just going on for you. And I think we did a lot better job of that during the pandemic, where people were hyper aware of their well-being, their environment, what they were doing to contribute to a problem versus not contribute to it, because we were hyper aware of the importance of health and what it meant to be healthy and what it meant to be able to sustain life. And it's interesting in just such a short period of time, what's it been, 2 years post pandemic, that we're starting to lose some of that very essence that I thought became so real to people during the pandemic. So I love that fact that you make it accessible, that you talk about awareness, and then you move towards, okay, if we start with just awareness, how are we going to keep this ball in motion?
So I have even another way of thinking about it too. I'm going to throw you with frameworks. So I told you I'm in that academic phase, so I have to be that person.
Great, give it to me. Give it to me.
I'm going to keep you going here. One of the also I think because as I say, climate and the aspects of equity are so interlinked with each other. Robert Livingston, he was one of my professors at Harvard Kennedy School. He talks about this press model. Most of the framework he uses around having the conversation around race and racism, but I think having the conversation around climate and our impact is also just very much important as well. Yeah. And his press model was interesting. It was standing for P was about the problem. What is the problem? Say, we know what the impact that climate change will have on our communities, on our organizations, and so forth. The R is like, how do we think about the root causes? So this kind of like breaking down that awareness piece that I mentioned in the necessary journey. What is the root cause of why we're actually here? And what are things that I can do to actually, address them? But then you get into the E, the empathy. Do I care enough? And I think we need to really build that sense of urgency of why people should care and framing it to them into the language that they need to hear, whether it's around business metrics as well, around revenue, if it's around the ethics of it, whatever you might have. Everyone hears things differently. Then that's when that care, we get into the actual strategies. And I think that's where you go down that necessary journey. But then we're going to get to a point where that S is going to be for that sacrifice. How do we sacrifice the old ways of doing things? And when you think about the use of coal and the fact that many of us are still driving cars like with diesel and gasoline cars.
Not me. I'm an EV.
Okay, EV. But we have to sacrifice the old way of how we used to think about things.
Most definitely.
I remember growing up as a kid and having my stick shift car. Like, there's no real stick shift car to like an electric car. And so I had to sacrifice, like, it was a good memory.
Yeah.
And it will be there in the past, but like, I can't move forward in that future. So it's that internal change that we need to do with each other, but then I'm broadcasting that within our business practices.
Yeah, I think what resonates with me from what you said is that it's really about having a human-centric practice of business. And that's at Aerobites, that's something we embrace. So empathy is one of our core values, along with integrity and honesty. But I think that in order to be empathetic, you have to care about someone besides yourself. And sadly, we don't necessarily live in a world or in a place where that's a norm, or it's sometimes a nice to have, unfortunately. And so how we begin that conversation is even better. But I think that's a great place to start, where you just have a conversation around that. And again, during the pandemic, that's all we did. It was a lot of conversations. People were very willing to be empathetic because it was life or death. We're starting to move away from that. So finding a way to shift that conversation back, I think, will be highly valuable and important. So I want to shift gears a little bit, because you mentioned that you wear lots and lots and lots of hats. Right. So you're on the accreditation side with NCQA, which is amazing, but you're also an educator, when it comes to the work that you do around change management, like you said, at Georgetown. You do quite a bit in that, and you mentioned just a little bit on the DEI space. I'm so curious, how do you, as a leader, wear all these multiple hats, but still get back to what's most important? Because I think that's an issue that comes up with a lot of leaders, right? You're wearing lots of different hats. The more I did a talk yesterday for a group, and one of the things I focused on was resiliency. So often, as you move through life, your career changes, your business changes, your organization changes, the opportunities get bigger, but so do the hurdles. So you're carrying frameworks, which are pretty heavy frameworks. Some people have one, you have, I think you mentioned like 4 or 5, right? So my goodness, Doc, how in the world are you as a business leader, but also, community leader, from the work you're doing with the medical meals, which is, I think, amazing. That's a whole nother conversation. We have to have you back for that. But how do you find ways for yourself to ensure that you're not taking yourself in so many different directions that you forget, the basics of what's most important? How do you do that? And then how does that bleed out into your work?
It depends on how you think about the work and your own contribution and your own leadership style. And so I think if you take the 90s version of leadership, we think very much about the vertical leader, like this person is the subject matter expert in this. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important. You need people that are hyper focused on figuring out that one thing. A lot of the ways that I kind of go with my leadership style is that I think we need a lot more horizontal leaders in the world as well. People that can see that bigger picture and can be the ones, they're not necessarily doing all of the work, but they are really creating the connective tissue between many different people that are focused on the same thing and building awareness with each other. At NCQA, and I've talked about this often with our health equity work, I use this analogy. I talk about the Justice League, and I'm like, okay, there's superheroes all across, the US here. And someone asked me, they were like, well, which superhero do you see yourself as? And I was like, well, actually, I don't see myself as the superhero. I see myself as the watchtower. I'm the area that people come together, commune, and really share best practices, share those lessons learned, and then go out and do more good work. And so I look at myself more as a catalyst than necessarily, leading the charge per se. Yeah. And I think that's okay. You need all these different cast of characters to make change happen within society and within organizations. And so I think I usually have you're going to laugh about this, another way, but it's my mantra I say for myself. Be hungry, be curious, and be humble. There's a whole idea of being hungry for what are the problems that we have to solve. I always tell my students, don't tell me what you want to do in the world. Tell me what problem you're trying to solve. Because when you solve a problem, you bring your whole self to the problem and your uniqueness and your lived experience. If I told you, hey, what do you want to do? I want to be a doctor. You framed yourself in this box about what you can and can't do based off what society's rules are. But then the aspect of being curious, there's many different ways to solve a problem. And it takes us kind of thinking outside the box and questioning why the box even existed. And I think a lot of people don't do that. And so I think we need some of those innovative ideas because that's how change happens. And then be humble. You have to do this with partnerships. You have to lead. And leadership involves bringing other people along on that vision with you. Yeah. And being able to talk different language. If you're only talking to your own kind of people, think of it like social media. If you're only friends with these group of people and you're constantly talking to them and showing pictures, of course everyone's going to like it because they're all talking amongst the same ecosystem. It takes a harder thing to go in different spaces and say the same messages and build those bridges. And so I think we need more bridges. And I think that's how I keep myself stable. I don't look at myself to solve everyone's problems. I look at my superpower really being the connector. How do we connect to groups and organizations to listen, reflect, and frame with an eye towards action?
Oh, I love that. That was fantastic. I hope you guys were taking notes. That was great, Doc. That was because I think you're right. I mean, and it has so much complexity layered into that because you're always a learner because you're humble about it. I don't have all the answers, but you're hungry to find and solve and bring new solutions. And was the third one be honest, or did I miss it?
Be curious.
Be curious. There you go. So you're constantly looking. So I think that's fantastic because I can easily see how you can become a conduit in that way. And that does the biggest thing I took away from what you were saying is that as you go through all these different communities, have all these different conversations, collaborate in all these different ways, you never get overwhelmed. You're never over anxious about it, because I don't have to be, like I always say people, when I do a lot of speaking, I would say, I'm not the only brilliant person in the room. There's brilliance in the collective. So
Yes.
please stop talking. You start talking. Let us start sharing, and then see what bubbles up from there. So I think that's
We
fantastic.
all know that collective action and collective intelligence, which is really the study of it, is so much better than any one person's idea. So I always like to,
Well, not everybody knows that. I'm not
like
gonna.
just as you said, I don't always like say I know the answer, but I know I have a large network of people that have pieces of the answer. And so
Yeah.
going back to our first point around climate change, I said we all have a part to play. So if we all have a part to play, how are we breaking down and making sure that we're all speaking the same language? And so that's why I said you need more horizontal leaders in that. How do you talk to business, people that are in public health, people that are in healthcare, people that, are in construction? It requires that, you need that Google Translate, and you need people that can be that Google Translate in the world.
Absolutely.
So that's really where I kind of see my space in leading with that work.
Fantastic. So as we round down this conversation, I'm so curious, again, touching so many different hats and so many different industries, what do you see coming on the horizon for 2024 that gives you hope with amounts to, what's happening in DEI, or what's happening in climate change, or even in education?
Yeah, I think what gives me hope is that we're starting to see people not seeing themselves as just like this one group of leading it, but really part of this larger coalition. And that's why I like the work I do so much with NCQA, because I always say we're advancing equity across the health continuum. We don't just work with health plans. We don't just work with healthcare delivery. We don't just work with providers. And being that unique intersection, I think it gives some ideas for how we can solve some of the other wicked problems that we have in society. And you're starting to see systems being put into place. Like, for example, even the climate and equity, group in the White House, the fact that there's actually a dedicated White House like department saying, hey, our focus is going to work on this, like with Gina McCarthy. And I got the opportunity to work with her when I was in school. Like, that's like amazing as we talk about, the administrations on having a health equity roadmap. That gives me hope. We're starting to systematize things that be on that necessary journey, and like taking not just talking about something, but
Yeah.
doing something. So that gives me hope. And I think in my tenure so far with NCQA, I've just been humbled to see the amazing passion from so many people across all the spaces I work in that are all trying to make the world a better place. So that gives me hope a lot.
Well, it has been fascinating to talk to you and just hearing to scratch the surface. I know you didn't share anywhere near the enormity of the work that you're doing, Dr. Buckley. You're very humble, but it's been really amazing and fascinating to hear some of the work that you have done and where your work is taking you. So continued success to you.
For sure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Excellent. And thank you all for joining us today for the Optimized Workplace. Remember, I'm your host, Fran Dean Bishop, and it's many, that's small, monumental moments that make the biggest difference in your life. Have a great day, everyone.